Welcome and thanks for tuning in. My name is Heather Seitz with Icon Engineering. I'm joined today by David and Jim from the Mile High Flood District, as well as Troy, who's also with Icon. We envisioned this as a panel discussion, so we do hope to hear some of your great stories and lessons learned at the end of this. I'll go ahead and get started with my presentation about a small project. All right, so this was a small project that we had that involved a house that had flooded 7 times in 17 years. Unfortunately, this house was constructed about 12 inches lower than it should have been based on the drainage report that had been filed with the development. It did have a crawl space that was constructed with a vapor barrier, so somebody had been aware and had been thinking, but the living room and garage were slab on grade, and these were less than the required 18 inches above the gutter flow line. So this made it very difficult to solve a lot of their drainage issues. As you can see by the map, there are about 100 acres here. If you can see my little mouse moving around, that area is approximately 100 acres, and the original design was a 24-inch pipe that went under the street here and a single inlet. So that's what it looked like before we started our construction. We met with the design engineers and knew that there was not going to be a perfect solution, but we decided to take advantage of every inch of capacity that we could squeeze in between these couple houses. So we put in a street-wide gallery inlet and a new 34-inch elliptical pipe, which we had to thread in between several other utilities in the street. Design was a fairly easy process. Again, there weren't a lot of alternatives. So this took just over 7 weeks for construction, and this even included several weather days. The picture here, you can see the high water line in the yard that was during construction. But after the project was finished, things went really well, and about a month or so after construction ended, we had a very large rain, and the homeowner actually called us to say how pleased she was. Things had worked great, and she was super happy. Now, that brought us to a little bit more than a month later. We, of course, had another great Colorado afternoon thunderstorm, and this one dropped about 1.5 inches of rain in the first 15 minutes and 2 inches overall. I was actually out on another site visit when the rain started, so I went to visit some other drainage areas that I knew were problematic and arrived at this site about an hour after the rain had finished falling. I went out thinking this was going to be a great win for me, just wanted to see how everything had performed, and kind of showed up totally blissfully ignorant. What I found was a real mess. As you can see, there were some floatable debris there at the fence. There was a high water line that was in the homeowner's garage right there. And the homeowner stated she had gotten water into her living room, as with the previous experiences. Neighbors said and had anecdotal evidence that there was water that was at least not knee to thigh deep in the street, and that they had to clear the debris out to get the inlets functioning. If you look at this picture of the inlets, you'll find it might be really hard to believe that they had to clear a lot of debris out. There was no other evidence of very large debris in the area. So I shifted into forensic engineer mode, trying to figure out how this project had gone so far south so quickly after construction. Unfortunately, the neighbors were not receptive to my questioning and my engineer mode, trying to figure out what was going on. So they were upset, and they felt the need to vent, and vented for about 45 minutes. After that, I went home and decided that was the end of a very bad day. Later on, we called our design engineers back and had them conduct a thorough investigation. There were a lot of measurements taken and a lot of modeling that was redone. We found the construction was mostly per plan, except for the fence. The fence had been designed to have an 18-inch gap so that water could flow through. The bottom of the fence, as constructed, was only 6 inches above grade, so this left a pretty significant difference for the water. This had been a request from the homeowner to the fence subcontractor. Unfortunately, we couldn't ascertain, but we think that the city inspector and the prime contractor may have been aware, but none of the design or city Supervising engineers were aware of this change. We did find one design flaw in the review, and that was that the back fence, which you can see in the bottom picture here, should have been constructed with a gap as well. This would allow the water to flow through the yard without impacting the house. Our design engineer ran the models again, found that if we made some changes to the fence, we could actually get that 10-year flow into the pipe and a 100-year flow through the swale in the yard. This was the original level of protection that was intended. So we did change, this is the final product. They ended up getting a graded fence. And it ended up that the design firm paid a third, the prime contractor paid a third, and the city paid a third to repair the damages inside of the house. So my lessons learned. Always take the time to explain to anyone who's going to be impacted by a project in the long term. Always get an agreement in writing. This agreement should include that the property owner understands the function and maintenance of a drainage item and who's responsible for what and when. Don't forget to be sympathetic or empathetic. Be able to take some venting, but still be kind. Also, know when to say enough. I had a line very clearly in my head that if anybody came towards me physically or if there was like really foul language, I would leave, but this wasn't crossed. Still, 45 minutes was probably more than I needed to take, and I should have left earlier for my own self-preservation. Lastly, solutions don't have to be perfect. You need to know when to say good enough. I'd also like to add that you should document your issues because you never know what will happen next. And a huge thank you to Andrew Fisher for helping me put this presentation together, digging through all of the old documents and photos. Now I'd like to turn it over to Dave with Mile High Flood District.
Well, thanks, Heather. That was a great presentation, very interesting. I'm going to share some career lessons I've learned, including a couple of personal anecdotes from when I had a supervisor or two put me in my place for good reason in ways that I learned from. I wasn't always this polished veteran that you see before you today. I had some rough patches I need to work through in my younger years. I'm going to share my screen here. Okay, well, many of you know Deb Olinger, the immediate past CASFM chair. Well, I worked with Deb at Olson for several years prior to working here at the district. I even worked with Deb and her husband back in Nebraska at a different consulting firm before that. So we go back a ways. And one time, Deb gave me a well-deserved attitude adjustment. We had this big project with the railroad for this line out in the desert. And as you can imagine, that's an awful lot of culverts and bridges, especially when you stretch this out to like 100 miles. Our team helped with a hydraulic analysis for sizing all of these small crossings that didn't have mapped floodplains. So this was straight up assembly line, soul crushing engineering work for days and weeks on end. It's a flat desert. So you could never get your cross sections to contain the flow. So there's like unbounded cross sections all over the place. It was profitable, but intellectually unsatisfying. And over a week or two, I just kind of whined incessantly about it. And, you know, woe is me. Why do I have to do this? Blah, blah, blah. Well, our whole team was having to do it. And one day I complained too much. And so Deb had heard enough from me, enough so that she actually smacked the table like a teacher with a ruler. And she said, "Dang it, Dave, we all have to do it. Just do it." I'm not proud of this, getting, Deb, one of the nicest people I know, that just mad at me. But I shut my mouth after that. So I think the point I'd want to share about that anecdote is don't bring negativity to your coworkers, especially if you're all working on something together. There should be more of a sense of camaraderie. Don't play the victim. In retrospect, maybe we should have tried to make that experience more fun, like make a game or a competition out of it or something. But regardless, don't bring negativity into the workplace. The second quick anecdote I want to share relates to me being a supervisor. And so I have a construction manager named Joe Williams, and he's worked with me for 10 years. And one time early in that period, I used just sort of a turn of phrase that wasn't really the right way to talk if you're a person who's a leader. So basically, I was talking to my supervisor, who at the time was Dave Bennett, and I was talking about something I needed to delegate to Joe, that I needed Joe to go and do on our behalf. And it wasn't something either him or I really wanted to do, but I had to have Joe go and do it. And when I was talking to my boss, Dave, I said, oh, I had to play the boss card and have Joe go and do this thing. And, you know, Dave, he didn't do this in an unpleasant way, but he looked at me and he said, Dave, I don't want you using language like that, you know, whether it's in regards to a consultant or a contractor or somebody else that works here. You know, we don't, you know, we're not hierarchical here. We're a very flat organizational structure, and I don't want you talking like that. And I thought about it, and I was like, gosh, he's right. Like I didn't need to puff myself up like that. And it, you know, when you're a leader, the words you use matter, language matters. So that was a lesson that I was really glad Dave told me that, and I definitely learned from it. So language matters. The last little lesson learned anecdote I'd want to share relates to how what makes you successful earlier in your career is not what's necessarily going to make you successful later on in your career. You know, when you're a young engineer, really what makes you good at your job is more about being an individual contributor. You know, it's doing the actual nitty-gritty engineering work, the hydraulic analysis, AutoCAD, all that stuff. But, you know, later on in your career, especially like where I'm at now, being successful as a watershed manager, it's more about budget management and project management and team building, negotiation, reading the room, communication about complicated issues with diverse groups of people. And these aren't skills we're innately born with, so you may have to go and seek out some training to cultivate them. So just keep that in mind. So just as an example, when I was a young engineer, it wasn't uncommon, and I blurred this out intentionally, don't try bother reading it because you won't be able to. It wasn't uncommon for me to send these voluminous encyclopedic emails like this to a client back when I was a consultant in particular. And buried in here, I might have 3 questions I needed that person to answer. And I'll just give you a newsflash. If you send an email like this, people probably aren't going to read it. So if you need them to actually answer something or take an action, make sure that sticks out somehow. So just in summary, with my lesson learned presentation 1, don't bring negativity into your workplace. It's not going to end well. You know, otherwise we're going to have to sick Deb on you. Number 2, when you're a leader, especially when you're a leader, language matters, how you talk matters. And 3rd, what makes you successful right out of school is not going to be the same thing that makes you successful 10 and 20 years down the road. And now on to Jim.
Thanks, Dave, for sharing those lessons learned. So lessons learned. Okay, so this is definitely a lessons learned project for me. Is a memorable one for me because it was one of the first projects I'd taken on after kind of passing my PE and also being given kind of more of a project management role. So my first trip into the wild, if you will. Now you can see from the title slide of the presentation here, things may not have gone fully as I had planned. So a little bit of background information. The project was being done for a maintenance division of the local municipality, and the city crews were actually going to be constructing the improvements for the project. And those crews were really more familiar with kind of the traditional hard armoring construction methods, so concrete line channels, grouted riprap, that type of thing. And they were specifically requesting that these be incorporated into the project. Now, the goals of the project were to remove sediment from the channel and size the channel so that it'd be capable of passing the 100-year flows. You can see in the picture here, a lot of sediment accumulation, and this was causing maintenance issues and also some floodplain issues for the surrounding properties. Unfortunately, in place of we couldn't manage the hard improvements that were requested due to permitting issues, so we decided to go with a trapezoidal, void-filled, armored natural channel approach. This was chosen, like I said, from wetland permitting issues and kind of constructability issues. So this picture here is showing the project just in January 2011, right after construction. You can see the void-filled lining on the bottom there, and it projects up into the banks underneath the blanket. So now this is what the site looks like today. Now, an observant CASFM member will probably note that the bank on the right side of the screen there is not void-filled riprap lining covered with lush green grass. definitely not the soft, inviting kind of park-like setting I envisioned. So, what happened here? What went wrong? Well, similar to Heather's story, we experienced a rather large August 2011 thunderstorm, which ended up maxing out all of the culverts in the area, and actually the roadway in the background there ended up overtopping. So the day after the storm, I did a drive-by inspection, and this is the scene I came up on. And so obviously a riprap failure at the upper end of the project, and really viewed this as a project failure on my part. Really no excuses here. This was a bonehead error on my part. I'd really failed to respect the trajectory of the flows coming into the project and being subjected onto the void-fill riprap that I designed. It's something that really VFR riprap is not meant for. Like I said, no excuses. A mistake should not have happened. Unfortunately, what I tend to do on some projects, especially as a young design engineer, I was getting stuck into the details. So I was really stuck on kind of critical elevations of structures, critical cross sections. And what I needed to be doing was to kind of back out of the project and take a bigger look at what was going on, what was happening coming into the project. And so overlaid on the figure here is a pencil that's roughly following the alignment of the culvert that's coming into the project. And naturally that pencil has a point on it, which is showing exactly where the trajectory of that culvert is and all the forces of it are coming into the project. And naturally it's also showing where my riprap failed. Here's it overlaid on the proposed improvements right after construction. Pretty much every project I've had after this one, I've taken the opportunity to just put a pencil on the plans to force me to look and see kind of where our flow is going. Really what this does is a simple design step that just makes me step back out of the design process and take that bigger picture view instead of diving into the details. It was, for me, I realized in times I can get stuck in the details, so I needed that reminder to kind of dive out the details and take that big picture view. Well, shortly after the event, the bank protection was repaired, and of course it was repaired with this grouted riprap. And so seeing this was kind of like, a dagger to the heart of my young drainage engineer's heart, and I got to admit it hurt a little bit. And really what it showed me was that over the design process as a project manager, I had not gone far enough to kind of convince the client and convince the team of the approach, that we did not get kind of ownership of the natural channel design approach, and definitely didn't get any buy-in from them. We'd maybe spent a little bit too much time focused on cost and permitting challenges instead of the challenges that came along with the natural channel design approach and how we would overcome those. And so as a project manager, I had missed my opportunity to manage my way to a successful project and not a lessons learned project. So this really rings true to me today with some of the more complex projects that we take on, and they're always going to have a new approach. And so more than ever, it's necessary to manage your way to a successful project. So that was my lessons learned. With that, I think I'll hand it over to Troy.
All right, thanks, Jim. I have a story to tell on some of the experiences as you go through some kind of legal action related to your engineering career. And hopefully no one has to go through this, but when you do, if you do, I think there's just some really good lessons learned that make it a very memorable experience for you. So in this example case, I'll spare a lot of the details, and it's certainly not worth showing any pictures, but this is a drainage project in the metro area. Everything seemingly went well through design and most of construction. Towards the very end of the project, there was a problem with access to the site, and there was a tragic event that happened, and suffice to say, everybody involved was horribly affected by this, and wanted to find the reasons and the explanations and how this all happened. And so these legal actions have a variety of stories. Several people that you work with and that you associate with will have their own stories. Some are much more minor, some are motivated by dubious means, and others are just natural occurrences. I think one of the things that occurred to me in this case was very quickly it was personal for a lot of people. There was a lot of deep emotions that went along with this that nobody anticipated as part of an otherwise kind of simple and straightforward project. And that's absolutely human and something everybody should feel. What I want to make sure happens is that particularly amongst the stakeholders, the design team, everybody can recognize that, give each other space for that. It's even if it's not a traumatic event, it's going to still feel personal and a little bit of an attack. Let that happen, and give everybody space for it, but don't let that dictate the rest of the experience. What I mean by that is we get into a legal process, and as one example, there's a summons that will come across in the mail and be very official, and 12 pages of legal discussion, and in so many ways the legal system and the legal process has a similar trajectory to what we do as engineers. We have some very detailed documents that we use to communicate information, and then we get together and talk through how it's going to work and get together. But on its face value, many of the engineering documents we put together are strange and hard to understand, and it takes more time to get through it. And so expect that this legal process, as you go through it, is going to be very complicated and seem dubious, and understand that there's more to come that helps explain it. And quite frankly, that's where legal representation on both sides of the issues are meant to help you and guide you through that process, and you should lean on that. I think what's also interesting on the legal process is that the prosecution and the defense and the judicial system have a sequence. They have a project that they're trying to finish, and a lot of it comes down to figuring out responsibilities and mitigating any errors that happen, and awarding the damages and such. Engineering has a similarly detailed process. We cannot explain what we do in a vacuum. We have to give a very long and descriptive example of it, where we started, how we got through that analysis, and what our conclusions were. Those two processes can be in conflict. The legal process will want to speed us through our engineering explanation. And so then that comes down to my final point, which is focus on the facts. Stick with everything our profession has taught us. And that is, as you're going through these depositions and getting questioned on the legal process, they're going to ask questions repeatedly from different angles, and you'll be forced to go back through what's likely a very long and descriptive answer. Stick with that. You're an engineer. That's what you're brought here to do, and focus on those engineering facts. If you can avoid any of this in your career, it's fantastic. But as things get more complicated, I think the engineering community should be ready for these things. Those little tidbits are just my experience in some lessons learned on getting through a case, and ultimately the settlement, the decision, and everything like that can actually preserve a lot of your professionalism, and your own feelings about going through a terrible and difficult process. I hope that helps everybody, and Dave, I'll hand it back to you.
All right, thanks, Troy. I think the lesson there is just try not to get sued is probably number one, but that's I can relate to a lot of that story. So Heather, did you want to sort of wrap us up?
Absolutely, and I agree. That email from legal saying, please get together every email or document regarding this case is the scariest one you're going to get. So we've got just a few minutes left in our time, and would welcome any stories or questions from the audience. If you'd like to share, we would definitely love to hear it. And thank you all again for being here.